Hi everyone, welcome to Crime Time. Today we're going to be exploring several cases that have to do with sexual abuse of children. And we're going to go and have an expert who happens to have been or visiting Los Angeles, so we're very lucky to have Francey Hakes here with us. She is a former federal prosecutor, and she's also the first national coordinator for child exploitation prevention and interdiction at the U.S. Justice Department. It's a very big title, but she's done an amazing amount of work for child abuse, for children, for all forms of sexual abuse, and we're going to talk about some of her cases. It's going to be pretty intense, but you know, we're going to find out how all of this works and how the police are able to catch criminals in some of the cases that she's dealt with, and sort of the role that the internet has played in proliferation, the growing amount of this sort of crime across all kinds of barriers in different countries around the world. So welcome, Francey.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. I think we have a lot to learn from you. Francey, I think first of all I wanted to start off with a case that Francey worked on involving Philip Gary. He is a Colorado man who was caught operating a file-sharing network, and I'm going to let Francey tell you a little bit about the case and sort of how it unfolded, and then ask some questions after that. So go ahead. Why don't you bring us up to speed a little bit?
Sure thing. Well, I might have misled you a little bit. The case originated in Colorado, but Gary was an Atlanta native. So in Colorado, ICE agents, that is, agents with the Department of Homeland Security, entered into a house and executed a search warrant in a child exploitation case, a child pornography investigation. And on this bad guy's computer, they found evidence that he'd been trading horrific images of child pornography with Philip Gary in Atlanta. So the Atlanta agents opened an investigation on Mr. Gary, and they went to execute a search warrant on his home based upon the information that he'd been trading back and forth, images of children being sexually abused with this man in Colorado. Now, when they executed the search warrant on his house, they found a lot of very interesting things. First and foremost, of course, they found his computers and his storage devices. And those contained thousands, tens of thousands of images of child pornography, including some of the worst I've seen with infants and toddlers involved. But he also had printed out pamphlets, how to molest children, printed out stories about incest and child sexual abuse, how to defeat law enforcement. And most importantly, in his basement, the agents went downstairs and they called me from the search scene, which wasn't all that common. When they called me from the search scene, they told me that they had found a kiln in Mr. Gary's basement. And they also had molds that were in the shape of baby dolls down there. Now, Mr. Gary was single, he wasn't married, he didn't have any kids. But he was, as you see from these photographs that are behind me and behind you, he had these baby dolls that were in various states of disarray. So there were pieces of dolls. They were burned, some of them, charred. There were arms in one basket, legs in another basket, pieces of the doll body and the head in other baskets. And as you can see, there were molds to form these baby dolls. So agents asked Mr. Gary, what were you doing with these molds and these baby dolls? He never answered the question about the baby dolls specifically, but he said that he was using the molds to make tofu baby dolls to eat. They also found in his backyard a little mound of dirt, and on the mound of dirt was like a stick with what looked like an infant shoe on the top of the stick. Well, they immediately thought that Mr. Gary had dead children in his backyard, and that was the first grave they would find. They dug it up. They didn't find anything underneath it. It remains a mystery as to why he had what looked to be a child's grave in his backyard. We never found any evidence on his computers of the kind of activity that we would be concerned about in a case like this, where profiler Jim Clementi might say he's either a serial killer already or a serial killer in the making. The fact that he was interested in eating molds of infants was a big concern for us. We never found any other evidence about it. He didn't go to trial. He ended up pleading guilty and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But it's one of the cases that haunts me and that I'm very happy because of the great work of the Homeland Security agents, that they caught him, hopefully, before he could engage in any even more depraved behavior than he already engaged in.
When this guy is trying to teach people how to defeat law enforcement, is that how to defeat them when you're buying and selling or watching pornography on the internet?
All of these things. So unfortunately, there are manuals across the internet. It's one of the reasons why the internet, in addition to being a great tool, is also a tool used by deviants to help each other. And that includes manuals on how to molest children, manuals on how to find children and groom them, manuals on how to avoid getting ensnared in law enforcement undercover operations online. What are some of the characteristics law enforcement use when they're acting in an undercover capacity? So these are things that the internet has allowed all of these offenders to share amongst themselves and with each other to defeat law enforcement, make it a lot harder to catch them.
Do you believe that if you find somebody who's engaging, not even to this extent, in child pornography or sexual exploitation of children, that there's any way to rehabilitate and release them from prison and they will be okay and could be back out among us?
Experts like Dr. Mike Burke, who is the chief at the U.S. Marshals Behavioral Analysis Unit, Dr. Joe Sullivan, who is an expert in Ireland on forensic psychology and treating sex offenders, these guys will tell you that there is no cure for pedophilia. So people who have a persistent sexual interest in children cannot be cured of that sexual interest in children. There's a lot of debate among the literature and among the experts as to whether or not they can be dissuaded from acting on that sexual interest. But all the experts agree you cannot cure someone of a sexual interest in children. And that's one of the things that is of the biggest concern to me when I look around the world and see how other court systems, England, for example, in the UK, how they treat those who trade images of child pornography, who I believe have a clear sexual interest in children. Most of the time, they don't even go to prison. And I do not think that is appropriately protecting the public, because I believe that once you have a sexual interest in children, you always have a sexual interest in children.
Now, do you think that the crime of trading and looking at these photographs invariably will lead to physical abuse or sexual abuse of children, simply that is an indication that somebody is sexually abused?
That's a great question, and that's a question that everyone around the world is trying to answer, specifically judges, the court system, prosecutors, defense attorneys. Everyone would like an answer to that question. And I'll give you an answer that law enforcement has come up with. So there's been studies done recently and some research by Dr. Michael Cito, for example, in Canada, and other research by Dr. Burke, who I've already mentioned, that shows specifically a link between pedophilia and child pornography offenders. In fact, the study by Dr. Cito showed that there is a bigger link, a stronger link between pedophiles and those who look at images of child pornography than there are between those who are child molesters. So think about that for a second. Someone who sexually molests a child, everyone assumes, well, they must be a pedophile. They must be sexually interested in children. And that is usually the case, but not always. You have offenders who are situational offenders. That is, they will be sexually interested in whoever they have the opportunity to abuse or molest. And sometimes that's going to be children. Whereas the people who seek out and trade and distribute these images of child sexual abuse are far more likely to have a devoted and single-minded preferential sexual interest in children than anyone else, which is why I've always argued that those who are trading in the images of child pornography represent a clear and present danger to the community and need to be incarcerated.
Okay, I mean, because I know it is a big debate. Let me also ask you, how long does it take after you, I see in the cases, and we have talked about this on the show before, but sort of the progression of how long it takes from actually finding somebody's computer, seeing those sexual images, and how long does it take between that and actually ending up at a trial? I mean, and is this person out in the community before that trial begins?
Unfortunately, that differs. I mean, that differs. In this country, we have a federal system, which has 93 United States attorneys' offices throughout the country that prosecute those kind of offenses. Then you have a state and local system where you might have state's attorneys or local district attorneys who are prosecuting those cases. And it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. My home state of Georgia, for example, has 190 some odd counties, many of whom have their own district attorney. So it's going to depend on who's prosecuting the cases. I know in my practice, it was very important to me to request that a judge in all cases involving crimes against children hold that person the minute those images were found and detain them prior to trial and keep them in jail as long as possible. But there are plenty of jurisdictions and prosecutors who disagree with me, certainly judges who disagreed with me, and thought that these offenders were not a danger to the community and either let them out on bond or gave them probation after sentencing.
It would seem it would be difficult for somebody who isn't an expert in a certain area to understand that link between looking at the images and actually committing sexual assault on children. I mean, then that you're taking away somebody's freedom based on something that they looked at or that they thought about rather than an act that they'd actually done.
Well, and that's a great point, because that is exactly where defense attorneys hone their argument in to the judges that they're arguing in front of. And I have actually heard defense attorneys say things like, these are just images. There is no actual victim. And judges buy, which is of course not true, but judges buy into this argument, especially because typically the person that they see in front of them is almost always educated, computer literate. They often have a family. They're often pillars of their community. They have a whole courtroom full of people speaking on their behalf, their minister or the coaches that they coached with, whomever it is, and they come forward and talk about what a wonderful person this is, and often there is not a shred of evidence that can be found linking them to hands-on offenses against children, and so judges feel like they're looking at people who've somehow slipped into some sort of slightly deviant but not that harmful behavior when they go and they seek out child pornography. And study after study has shown us that not to be the case. In fact, a recent study done by some of the employees at the Department of Justice have, using polygraph techniques, they've gone and found that in approximately 65% of the cases where the offenders agree to do polygraphs, they have confessed to hands-on child molestation offenses that were previously completely unknown, undisclosed, undiscovered by law enforcement. That is a massive percentage, and yet you still have defense attorneys and judges across the country who look at 65% are hands-on molesters and think, well, that doesn't apply here in this case, or it's not this guy, and so they just don't take the cases as seriously as they should.
Well, let me ask you about your next case that we were going to talk about, James Bartholomew Husky. And this one starts with the police in Queensland, Australia. Do you why don't you give us a little bit of a background on it, and then I'll ask you a few questions about it, because this one is also an example. I'm talking about James Bartholomew Husky, that here is a situation where we have to talk also about the victims and the people that end up in these photographs. How do you find them? How do you counsel them? And that's also something that I wanted to talk to Francey about too. So let's first give a little background about this particular offender, and then let's talk about what do you do with those photographs, because I think people are interested in that as well.
Right, sure. So you see behind me Mr. Husky, and what I'm happy to report is Jailhouse Orange, which sort of spoils the story. But
we're not doing the 48 hours where they're like, you only photograph them from here up until we find out the end.
That's right. So the case started off, as you said, in Queensland, Australia, with Task Force Argos, a fantastic group of agents and investigators in Australia who were, who sort of almost by chance, in investigating a child pornography case, they found an offender's computer. And on this computer, they found evidence of a group, or bulletin board as is known sometimes online, a group of offenders who were very secretive and had a lot of items that they used to defeat law enforcement surveillance. For example, they used very sophisticated encryption within the group. They had lots of rules to become members of the group, for example. Many child pornography image series, that is a series of a child who's been spotted around the world in these horrible images, are given a name so that law enforcement can share information about that set of images of this particular child. And in order to get into the group, these offenders had to answer questions that indicated they had a very strong working knowledge of all kinds of child pornography images, that they collected them, that they knew when you referred to Tara, for example, which ended up being this case, they knew what child that was, and they could describe some of the images of the abuse of the child. So it was a very sophisticated group. And the Australian police found evidence of that on this offender's computer and went undercover to try to figure out who the members of the group were, because they were anonymous. It wasn't easy for them to find out who they were because they were using things like anonymizers and routers. So using the same techniques of just looking at someone's IP address, which is what law enforcement historically did, weren't necessarily going to work here. And they eventually started.
That's like where it'll ping all over the world until
That's
you
right.
find
It'll
like
ping, or it'll just ping somewhere that the person's not. It'll ping in South Korea when really they're sitting in London. So they eventually started seeing images of a little girl. And this little girl in the images, when they first started seeing her in 2006, appeared about 5 years old. And between 2006 and 2008, while this investigation was ongoing, she aged. And it ended up, she looked around 9 years old. And one of the final images that they saw before they realized that they absolutely had to find this child. As is unfortunately the case in many of these investigations, they have to prioritize with the limited resources law enforcement are given on which children to look for, which cases to thoroughly investigate. But here, one of the images they spotted of the child was of the offender holding a very large butcher knife to the child's throat. There were also images of this butcher knife being held to the child's head and to the child's genitals. There were all still images, there were video images of this child, there were hundreds and thousands of images. So they knew that this offender had a very close access relationship with the child. So they immediately started searching through those images themselves to see what they could find in them that would lead them to the child's location. And fairly early on, they discovered, because of the plugs, outlets, that it was going to be an American child. So they were able to limit that fairly early, and they sent what they call the lead to the FBI in Virginia and asked them for help in locating the child. It took 2 years from the time they first identified this, or first saw this little girl, to the time that they finally identified the offender, because he was doing very sophisticated things. He was pixelating his face, so you couldn't see his whole face, so you couldn't run him through facial recognition, for example. Sometimes he pixelated the child's eyes to make it harder to see who she was. He used a clown mask sometimes when he was sexually assaulting the child. These were very...
That's really creepy.
It's very creepy. It was a very serious case, the worst images I've ever seen in any case. There were hundreds and hundreds of them of him molesting and sexually assaulting this child. She was finally found because of the great work by some state and local police in Maine, who decided to look at things like the backgrounds and the walls, the photographs and the images of a hotel, the bedspread in the hotel room, the carpet, the wall coverings. They looked at all of those things. And it finally led to the man that you see on the screen behind me, James Bartholomew Husky, who went by the name of Bart Husky. And even more sinister, as you might already guess, his profession, he was a tennis coach of young girls. And the child that he was abusing was very close to him, and he was able to have complete and total access to her. And one of the most frightening things and most significant things about the case was that when we debriefed him after he agreed to plead guilty in the case, I was robbed of trying the case against him. He pled guilty. The evidence was so strong against him. But after he agreed to plead guilty, we asked him, why did you start molesting your daughter at 5? You know, what brought that on? And he said that he had been trading child pornography with others, and he'd run out of fresh child pornography. And it's like baseball cards to these guys. They want new, they want fresh, they want the latest, they want sometimes on-demand images. And his daughter was 5, and he knew that he had access to her, and he could simply abuse her as much as he wanted, and so he did. And he said that then he had fresh images to trade with others, and then was able to get more child pornography that he could consume in return.
What is usually the answer to that question? Because it's kind of, there is a feeling when you talk to the older generation that this type of pornography and child abuse wasn't present in the amount that it is present these days. Do you think that that is true, or it's simply that we know more about it? Because, I mean, I've actually spoken to my mom about this, where she said you'd be warned when you went to a theater to not sit next to certain men, or that kind of thing when she was, you know, a young girl. But do you think that it is has become more pervasive amongst, there are more abusers, or was it something that just wasn't discussed before?
Right, so that's a great question. And I think I'll start off by saying that the Postal Inspection Service, who were sort of the original investigators of child pornography, because back in the 70s, child pornography was traded via the mail. That was the only way to do it. It was on tapes or just still images that were printed out. And they largely eradicated it because they were able to control it coming in and out of the borders. So in the 70s, they felt like they'd largely eradicated child pornography. Then, of course, with the internet came the explosion in what I think is an epidemic in child pornography. I think that the sociological reasons are very complicated, but one primary reason for the explosion in child pornography is the anonymity that the internet affords people. It allows them, like this group in Australia, to gather in a group of people. In the old days, you'd have the guy in the darkened movie theater or the guy in the trench coat on the playground, and he would be ostracized by society. Everyone would know to look out for him. He would know that his sexual interests were deviant. He would probably believe that his sexual interests, that he was alone in them. He certainly wouldn't know anyone else who had those sexual interests that he could talk to. Well, on the internet, you can find a chat room or a group to talk about anything. There are chat rooms right now on the internet that are devoted to the topic of pedophilia, moms who are pedophilic, dads who are, people who want to talk about toddler porn. You can go and find anything you want to talk about, and these other people will reinforce your sexual interests. And so I think that has led to an explosion in child pornography distribution and trading, and in the increased risk to children of child abuse, because if someone trades baseball cards, for example, I don't know if you ever knew anyone who was obsessed with baseball cards.
Yes.
Anyone I knew as a kid obsessed with baseball cards lived to go to the ball game.
Right.
They didn't want to just look at the cards. They wanted to go to the game.
That's a terrible, yeah.
And
it's an appropriate analogy.
And the same is true here. They don't want to just look at the images of sexual abuse of children. They want to find them. And so the issue is everyone who's looking at images going to go out and molest a child? We can't say that with certainty, but I don't think it's worth taking the risk. I think they should all be in jail.
Let me ask you this. What about the focus of law enforcement when you have this many people involved, and say you have this whole group in Australia and around the world that we're starting there, where they're trading different images? How is the focus of law enforcement? In this case, it was on finding the young girl that was, I guess, clearly it looked as if her life was in danger by saying somebody with a knife to her throat. In addition to the fact that she will have emotional problems for the rest of her life, but that. I guess my question is, what is the focus? Is it the victim, or is it the perpetrator?
Well, there's really a dual focus. I mean, obviously, law enforcement, their whole reason to be is to get the bad guy and put someone in jail, to get someone investigated, to prosecute them, and to put them in jail to protect society and to mete out the punishment that they deserve for committing the crimes that they have. But in these cases, also, their focus has to be on finding the children.
But there's so many thousands of pictures. I mean, and
millions
of pictures of children, and you don't know. I mean, that's why I asked. Maybe if you just would have to start with the perpetrators and then try to sort out who the victims are. And the victims oftentimes or most of the time are under the control. Sometimes it's even in a family. I mean, so like in this instance. So
most sexual abuse actually does happen in the family. I think it's some 85%. But fortunately, we in the United States have a group, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And when they were established in the 80s, their goal was to help missing exploited children. And about a decade or 15 years ago, Congress asked them to have another mission. And that mission was to maintain a database of all of these images of children who are being sexually abused and to try to identify those children. So they have the Child Victim Identification Program, CVIP. And to date, they have analyzed, I think it's over 100 million million images at this point in the last decade and identified over 5,000 children. Now, 5,000 children is a tremendous amount of children, and the center does a tremendous amount of work. But as you can guess, with 100 million images and only 5,000 children identified, there are many, many thousands or hundreds of thousands, even more, children out there who have not been identified. Law enforcement simply doesn't have the resources, the personnel, the sophisticated technology to do it. I saw an article just the other day from the head of the national crime, the head of the the National Crime Alliance in the UK, their new head, and he was talking about having the technology that told them that at any given moment there might be 50,000 offenders in the UK trading child pornography. And that he admitted law enforcement will simply be unable to bring 50,000 of them to anywhere near 50,000 of them to justice. And so their goal was to prioritize which of those 50,000 represented the most clear danger and high risk to children. But my question to him is, and to every policymaker across the world, how are you going to determine who is a higher risk to children? Because we've seen plenty of examples where offenders have vile and very low-aged toddlers and infant images of children, but no evidence they molested children. We've seen lots of child molesters who we've never necessarily found images of child pornography, and yet they're out there molesting children. So science has not given us a good answer to that and how to prioritize those cases. And so while I think it sounds good for the public to believe, well, we're going to prioritize, we're going to find the higher risk offender, that sounds good, but it's almost impossible to do. And so the only thing, in my opinion, to do is give law enforcement the tools that they need. Give them more people, more technology, more technicians, because as you asked me earlier, it takes months to review someone's computer, which could be full of a terabyte or more of data, and give them more prosecutors to prosecute the cases. And if that means building more jails, I don't think that's very popular, but if that's what it means to protect our children, that's what we have to do. I think that if these policymakers had ever looked into the eyes of these children who are being abused, which I have, and will never forget a single image I ever saw, they would change their tune quickly, and they would stop funding stupid things and start funding this. When I was a state prosecutor before I was a federal prosecutor, and I used to think the hardest thing I'd ever have to do was looking into the eyes of a child sitting in my office who'd been molested by her dad or her stepfather or mom's boyfriend or uncle or whatever, and trying to get justice for that child. But I was wrong. The hardest thing I ever had to do was, as a federal prosecutor, looking at images of children being abused, video, still images, crying out in horrible pain or with that awful vacant stare, knowing that I don't know who that child is, probably no one knows who that child is, and most tragically, no one's ever going to be able to find that child and rescue him or her. That is the hardest thing about these cases, looking in their eyes. And I don't know how anyone can look at their eyes and say, we just don't have the money. That's just not an excuse. It's just not.
Well, I mean, to me, it seems to be like a horrifying thing to even think about you having to see those kinds of images. I mean, let alone for those children to have to deal with it. But the idea that we're talking about toddlers and it brings me to this question, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers are thinking the same thing. Do these guys even think what they're doing is wrong? And if they don't think what they're doing is wrong, does that make them insane?
They're not insane. They're definitely not insane because they do understand that what they want is wrong. But you have advocacy groups out there, for example. Have you ever heard of NAMBLA?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that while you were talking about it.
The North American Man-Boy Love. Yeah, right, exactly. The North American Man-Boy Love Association.
You've heard about it, but
no,
yes, I have.
No, definitely not. But so advocacy groups exist, and occasionally, and in fact there was an article recently, I can't remember what magazine, there was an article recently or paper that advocated for decriminalizing this to a certain extent because they argued pedophilia is an illness, and if it is a mental illness, then they are not, or at least the argument's logical end is if it is an illness, then they are not responsible for their sexual interest in children, and therefore cannot and should not be punished for acting on that sexual interest. I think it's a terrible slippery slope, and I just don't know how anyone with a straight face can say that if you are sexually interested in children, you're ill and shouldn't be punished for acting on that. I just think that's wrong.
Well, I think to me, the argument then could be made that you're drinking too much, you have an alcohol illness, which we do recognize as an illness, but you're still responsible if you get in a car and kill somebody because you've been drinking. I mean, you know that if you act on this behavior that is wrong and hurt somebody else, then you've committed a crime. I mean, so it's, you know, I don't, it doesn't really work for me, but I was just curious if when you sit and look into the eyes of the pedophiles, if they actually know or think that this is wrong for him to have abused his daughter like that, for Husky to abuse his daughter like that.
Well, speaking of Husky, I did look into his eyes for about 4 hours while we debriefed him, and all I saw from him was pride. He considered himself and mentioned that he thought he was a bit of an artist when it came to the filming. And in fact, during the film, while he was videotaping his sexual assault of his daughter over hours and minutes that it took place, he would change the angle of the camera. As you were watching, he would stop what he was doing, change the angle of the camera, and have a running commentary on how she looked or how it felt or what was happening, and would say horrible, nasty things to the child, call her names while he was engaging in her sexual assault. And I never saw a sense of shame from him until conveniently we were sitting before the judge and he was arguing about why he shouldn't go to prison for 70 years. Mr. Husky's arguments did not work, and he is going to be sitting in prison for 70 years, in fact. But he had no sense of shame. And most of those that I've prosecuted with respect to images of child pornography, they just don't think they've done anything wrong. They claim they've never abused any single child, and they don't understand why they should be in prison for what they've done.
Okay, that was one of my major questions. Let's talk now a little bit about Wayne Cody Merida. In 2000, a driver was making a routine delivery in Marietta, Georgia, and he was about to leave with his truck. He saw a young girl stumbling towards him with blood running down her legs, and she was supposed to have been killed by the perpetrator in this a sexual assault, and he had left her for dead, but she had survived. So I'm going to let you sort of take over here, because this is kind of interesting to me in the sense that the case eventually is made through DNA, although there was a great deal of evidence in the perpetrator in Cody's house that he had engaged in sexual abuse of this child.
There was, so Cody Merida was a psychopath. In fact, he was a diagnosed psychopath. And one of the most interesting and significant things about this case was I am not sure, and in fact, I think that without the child's description of him after her survival, I'm not sure he ever would have been uncovered as being the offender in the case. So the child was kidnapped from her apartment complex at gunpoint and snatched into his car and then taken to a remote location where he sexually assaulted her violently and then strangled her repeatedly and left her for dead, as you said. But she wasn't dead, and when she was rescued, she almost immediately, after going to the hospital and receiving necessary treatment for the injuries that she received, she went to the police department and gave, at 5 years old, gave a sketch artist enough information that they did an absolutely amazing sketch of Merida. And someone recognized him that went out all over local television. Someone recognized him as being a person that had worked for them a year prior. And that is how police were led to him, no other way. Because he had a prior conviction for a similar offense, kidnapping and assaulting a child, but he was 15 at the time. So those records were sealed because he was a juvenile. So no juvenile authorities turned over his information. No juvenile authorities saw his picture, and we understood later that one of them at least recognized him. No one called the police to tell them they thought that that sketch was actually Cody Merida. So but for his victim, Cody Merida might still be at large, and I'm certain would have kidnapped and killed other children. So this child had a very strong survival instinct. There was DNA taken, of course, from the scene, and he had all sorts of evidence in his car, the gun, rope. He was a psychopath, and his doctor that had been treating him as a juvenile testified at his sentencing that he in fact was a psychopath and needed to be put away the rest of his life. And in fact, he will never get out of prison, fortunately. But it was a very difficult case because the DNA was what they call mixed, And so you didn't have, sometimes you'll see DNA profiles where it's, the odds of it being anyone besides the offender are 1 in like 8 billion. And there aren't even 8 billion people on the planet. So you can feel pretty confident in those DNA results. This was not nearly that large. It was a mixed sample because there was so much of the child's DNA mixed in and blood of hers mixed in that back then they didn't quite have as good a technology as we have now with respect to DNA. So the DNA evidence was there, but it wasn't quite strong. The most frightening thing about this case was that while we were among many others, while we were 100%—
The most frightening is—
we were 100% confident we had the right person, we found out later that on the first vote of the jury, they voted 10-2 to convict. So 2 people in the jury room on their first vote voted not guilty. Now, eventually, they were persuaded the other way, but that was a very frightening thing to learn later, that with the DNA evidence and the testimony of the child, she testified.
Did you question them as to why they had, were you allowed to discuss it with them?
Yep, it was all about the DNA. Because the DNA was not 100% rock solid, they decided that there wasn't enough evidence.
Did they wonder what he was doing driving around with those items in his car?
They weren't too troubled by the rest of the evidence, apparently.
Wow.
That's the danger, I think, of some of these shows, which I love, like CSI, where they, especially today, where they talk about an overwhelming amount of physical evidence found at every crime scene. Sadly, it isn't always the case. And in fact, there are plenty of child sexual assault and other sexual assault cases where there's not a lick of evidence, DNA or otherwise, no physical evidence. It's just the child's word against the offender. I've tried many of those cases. And I think that today it's harder to prosecute those cases than it used to be. But the child in the Marita case was incredibly brave and took the stand at 5 years old. And the defendant had completely changed his looks by the time we got in court. He had kind of a short haircut and was a workout buff and was tan. And by the time we got into court, he had long hair, he wore it in a ponytail, he was wearing glasses and was very pale and looked completely different. And I couldn't imagine any 5-year-old actually being able to identify him. And when I asked the child if she saw the man who had taken her somewhere in the courtroom, she looked around the courtroom and over to where the defendant sat, studied him for a second, but looked past him and then actually looked over to the jury box. She didn't know who was who, so she continued to look around the courtroom and eventually said, "No, I don't see him." And I thought, oh dear, we're sunk. So then I took the bookend photo that the police had taken of him at the time, and I showed it to her. And she had a visceral, physical reaction to the photo and said, "No, no, 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 I don't recognize him. I don't see him." It was obviously a fearful response, which we were able to, the jury did take note of later. And one of the things that the jury never heard and that would never have heard was as she went out into the hallway after her testimony, she said to her mom, "Mama, I saw the man who took me in the courtroom." So she had seen him, but was too afraid to point him out with him sitting there.
Yeah, it seems to me that it would be terribly difficult. I mean, how does a jury usually react to a child's word against an adult's word? I mean, if the guy doesn't look like, as you like to say, Chester the molester, I mean, if he isn't your classic, typical kind of molester look that we see on television, or he's not wearing a trench coat. How does the jury respond to that oftentimes? Child versus regular-looking man in the courtroom.
It's difficult. It's difficult. And most offenders don't look like Chester the molester. Cody Marita, when he was arrested, didn't look like Chester the molester. He was a decent-looking 22-year-old man who appeared to be interested in fitness and the normal things that 22-year-olds are interested in. So I think that was hard for the jury. I think it is very hard for the jury to take the word of a child over an adult. And like I said, I've tried many cases where that is the only evidence that you have. And so what you rely on then is evidence of how many times the child has told the same story. Was it consistent? Did the child's sexual knowledge that he or he displays when they're talking about what happened to them, is it far more than what a child their age should have, and only something that a child who's been molested should have? Now, in these days with the internet, that quantification gets a lot more complicated because kids are exposed to a lot more sexual material at a lot younger age. So I think that argument is harder to make. And that's when you rely on experts, like the experts at child advocacy centers all over the country. There's one in Marietta called Safe Path that is an expert, and they treat and counsel children who've been victimized by abuse, and they come and they talk about the child has now been in therapy for a year and a half. She's maintained a consistent story about what happened. She's drawn pictures. She's used the dolls, the anatomically correct dolls, to describe her behavior is consistent with someone who's been victimized. Those are the things that you have to rely on because you don't often have physical evidence.
Now, I'm going to ask you I have one last question because we're getting a little bit low on time here, but I was curious. There seems to be this feeling now in the country, across the country, that there are allegations of sexual molestation that are untrue, and they particularly arise during divorce scenarios where each parent will accuse the other in a custody battle of engaging in sexual molestation of the child. So my question for you is, how frequently are there false allegations of a child being sexually abused? And when you hear those kinds of allegations, how do you proceed? I mean, what do you do with that in terms of the totality of the circumstances?
So I've had cases like that where the allegations arise only after a divorce is filed.
It's very common here in California that's almost become like pro forma, along with somebody being bipolar. They also engaged in sexual abuse.
Well, and it's an awful thing. It's an awful weapon to wield against someone else because once someone's been labeled a sex offender, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for them to get the reputation back or for the truth to come out or for the truth to even matter to people because it is an electrifying allegation to make. However, I have had cases where in the course of a divorce, children disclose actual abuse because now that they're out of the house of the offender, they feel safe and they feel like they can come forward and disclose abuse. So it really cuts both ways. I think that it's very important to have well-trained police officers and most importantly, well-trained forensic interviewers. That is, people whose entire job is to interview children about allegations of sexual abuse and to understand the process of disclosure that children engage in. And it's really not that difficult to break down a story that is a false allegation once you've spoken to the child. I had a case myself where in a divorce situation, a mother accused a father of sexually abusing the girls, and then she kidnapped them and took them to a different state. Now, the father and the mother, before she kidnapped them, both took polygraphs. He passed, she did not. Very quickly after the girls were recovered from the kidnapping, they went right back to their father, they went back to school, the mother wasn't allowed to see them, and they started doing really well in school. They saw a therapist. They told the therapist on the first or second visit that mommy had told them to say those things. So these are things that it's very difficult, especially a child under the age of, say, 8 or 9, to maintain any kind of consistent false story that contains the level of detail that you will see in true allegations.
Well, you also had this case that you gave to me to take a look at of Thomas and Andrea Porter, and the fact that Andrea and Thomas, I guess, were living, they got married, and there was an ex-husband involved, and he was concerned about allowing his son Tony to be with his ex-wife and her new husband. And ultimately, basically what transpired is that Tony was sexually assaulted by the husband, the stepfather, and the wife, assisted in trying to cover it up. What actually happened to the wife in those in the proceedings and in the prosecution? I was curious. Her name's Andrea. So
yeah, this was maybe the most horrific case of child abuse, short of child homicide, that I have ever seen. The child was repeatedly assaulted over a period of a week with a curling iron. Thomas Porter struck the child, punched him repeatedly in the stomach, strangled him several times, revived him. Porter was a medic in the Army. So he knew how to do that. He knew that the child would stop breathing, and then he revived him again, and it would go on and on for a solid week. Andrea, the child's mother, ignored all the signs. After the curling iron incident, the child would have been completely incontinent. He would have been badly burned. He would have been in agony. He had obvious burns on his legs as well. And she did nothing to rescue the child.
I know. It's so appalling.
It's totally opposite what we like to think, which is of that of a mother sort of lion protecting her young. And in fact, in these cases, I found the opposite to be true. Finally, after Thomas Porter had abused the child so severely that he could not revive him, instead of calling 911 or taking him to the hospital, he called his wife home from work. she took the time to come all the way home from the base to where they were living, and then they put the child in the car and then drove him to the emergency room, by which time he suffered brain damage. He was
It's a colostomy bag.
blind. It's a horrible, horrible case. And this was a case where the natural father of the children had some concerns. He tried to get a judge to believe that he shouldn't send the children to visit. And tragically, a judge ordered him to send Tony to them, and he was abused and will never be the same.
Well, I mean, I hate to end on that note, but this is a really serious topic, and this is something you've devoted your life to. I think, just so everybody knows, Francey Hakes writes a blog, and there's a lot of information on the blog. If they want to look at it, what is the website for? If you want to give it.
It's franceyhakes.wordpress.com.
Okay, so you guys should go and take a look at that. She's written some very good articles. There's also some articles on CNN.com by Francey, so just sort of take a look through there. I want to thank you for coming in and educating us somewhat, a little bit, giving us a little sense of what you've done during the course of your career. And I want to thank you all for watching. I know it's a really tough topic, but I think it's something that should be discussed. And I think it was also important to understand how you can report things and try to help and look out for the children that are around you, because really the police are facing an uphill battle in trying to find the victims of these crimes. So whatever you could do, you should try to do. But thank you so much, Francey, for being here. And we'll see you next time on Crime Time.